David works as a consultant, trainer, and advisor with the cross-section of social enterprises, social purpose businesses, and social impact investors. He's also the founder of Social Canada, the chair of the Social Enterprise Council of Canada, teaches MBA students, a member of Social Enterprise World Forum Steering Committee, part of this CCEDNet Policy Council. So he's has been pretty active in the social enterprise space for years and was one of the key organizers for this trip. Darcey Penner is a Social Enterprise Policy and Program Manager with CCEDNet in Manitoba. He's been working in community economic development since graduating from the University of Winnipeg with a BA in politics. And in the last 3 years, his role has seen him work with member organizations in Manitoba to pursue a broad policy agenda and significantly helping co-create the Manitoba Social Enterprise Strategy with the province. And he was also contributing author to the Alternative Municipal Budget for CCEDNet Manitoba. I'm going to quickly take you through what we're going to discuss today. That's a picture of our group that went over there. A few of you might recognize yourselves in there. Cross-section of Canadians who are involved in social enterprise from across the country, Nova Scotia, BC, Quebec, so from all over, and working both supporting social enterprises, but also working in government. So we were really fortunate to have representation from multiple levels of government, which is really helpful. So our agenda for today is, I'll start by giving you a quick sense of the context of Scotland's social enterprise ecosystem, talk through what we did on the trip, and then we'll be sharing some reflections focused on 3 key areas: policy and ecosystems, relationships and connections, sector observations, and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. Okay, so the social enterprise landscape is, it is pretty large and vibrant. For a relatively small population, they have over 5,000 social enterprises, and I'll walk you through some numbers in a second, but you'll be able to see that they've come this way over a period of time, working closely with government and with a comprehensive supportive ecosystem. And that government support is really grounded in a policy of inclusive growth. And we'll talk about that further later today. And 2 of the key values that certainly came through for me throughout the visit were collaboration between different actors in the ecosystem and a real sense of being grounded in community and being community driven. So that was really interesting and refreshing to see. Here are some numbers from the latest census they had last year. And I'm going to draw your attention to the boxes outlined in red. So over 5,000 social enterprises currently operating that are employing over 112,000 people and earning 3.6 billion pounds a year. So pretty significant numbers. They do have a fair amount of volunteers as well. And interestingly, you see the box on the bottom left, 60% of them are led by a woman. So it just reinforces what we've, I guess, known for a while, that social enterprise is also something that supports feminist values, or can at least. More numbers. You can see here that, and again, drawing your attention to the boxes in the red, social enterprises are worth over 8 billion pounds, and they're producing almost, a quarter of 2 billion pounds per year for the government every year. So they're making an economic contribution, and they're doing so at a rapid pace, 200 new forming every year. So you'll see that while they're worth a lot of money, the net worth is 3.86 billion, so taking out liabilities as well. And you can see more information on the social enterprise in Scotland. Census 2015, we were lucky enough to have a presentation by Jonathan Coburn of Social Value Lab, who walked us through these numbers and gave us a lot more in-depth information about the sector. And to also talk about what I had touched upon before, social enterprise is really a part of Scotland's economic strategy. There's inclusive growth is a really important part of what they want to achieve. Innovation is part of their goals. Investment, and you'll see there the last point on the left on the investment is they're investing in communities. That's part of their strategy. And internationalization. So they're not just doing this for themselves, but they're looking to see how they can be sharing what they've learned over the years with the world. And coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the headquarters of the Social Enterprise World Forum are also located in Scotland. And this is an image that shows you the different elements that they have in their ecosystem. And one of the things that our host, Jerry Higgins of Community Enterprise in Scotland, keeps saying over and over again is that there's no point in raising awareness if you're not opening public sector markets. There's no point in opening public sector markets if you're not providing supportive policy and legislation. There's no point in doing any of these unless you're doing all of them, which is also a really, I think, important insight for all of us, is that, it's only as strong as the weakest link. I guess before I move on, Darcey, David, do you want to add anything to what we've just shared?
I think, Nabil, that context that it's all integrated and how the census was done as a benchmark in order to start to understand the sector, but then the ecosystem is something that's been evolving, and it's still evolving, and I think we'll get into that as we start to talk about some of the examples.
I want to add an interesting piece that I was thinking about when reflecting on this is how the ecosystem, while largely state-funded, is delivered in a similar relationship to how the procurement through social enterprises is delivered. That is with service agencies and social enterprise partners delivering on the program and working with the government to create that ecosystem. So it's kind of twofold in terms of them supporting that procurement method with the actual social enterprises themselves, but then also delivering the social enterprise supports in a similar model.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be touching on this during the course of the presentation as well. So moving on, here's what we did while we were there, and it seems like we certainly packed a lot, but it went by really quickly from my perspective. The first day we were when we got there, we met our hosts at CEIS and and had this introduction to the landscape and met some intermediaries. I have a slide, I'll share them in a second. The second day, we had some engagement with government. In the Scotland government, it's the third sector that governs charity, nonprofits, the voluntary sector, and social enterprises as well. And we were able to see the launch of the Internationalizing Social Enterprise Strategy, which you can also see online. On the third day, we attended Scotland's conference on social enterprise policy and practice in Glasgow, and that was also, like any other social enterprise conference that you've attended here, but really interesting to see the diversity of actors they had there and the things they talked about. So, for example, one thing that really struck to me was the last session there was about building talent for the sector, and they spent, I think it was an hour talking about how do we attract people and retain the best talent for social enterprise to keep the sector growing, which is a conversation that I think is important for us to be having here in Canada as well. This is a picture of the conference. You'll see David there on the left, Catherine Scott from ESTC, the federal government, talking about how Canada and Scotland are building a relationship in social enterprise. We had, of course, Yvonne Strachan, who is one of the senior officers in government in Scotland, visiting Canada earlier this year, as well as Jerry Higgins, and they were able to meet government representatives. So this is definitely an ongoing conversation. Here you'll see some of the intermediaries that we met. Ready for Business is CEIS supports social enterprise. Ready for Business is specifically focused on procurement support. SenScot is Social Enterprise Network Scotland. Interestingly, they have at least 3 networks of social enterprises in Scotland. Social Firm Scotland is one of them on the bottom right. Social firms in Scotland are what we might refer to as B Corps or for-profit social enterprises here in Canada. So they have a separate network for for-profit social enterprises and a separate networks for non-profit social enterprises. Just Enterprise, really interesting. That's a consortium of 10 intermediaries that is fully funded by government to provide end-to-end support to social enterprises at any stage. If you're an enterprise and you need support, Just Enterprise will do that for you. And Highlands and Islands Enterprise on the right side, they're the counterparts in the rural areas. So if you're in
so I would actually say,
sorry, go ahead.
Nabil, that HIE is a bit like our Community Futures, but more engaged. So they do they're the lenders, there's developers, but they're really much more an activator in the rural communities. And I think the thing that's interesting to point out here is how many intermediaries exist. And to look at this slide today, and I think in 3 years we'll see a different slide as they're recognizing their intermediaries are kind of starting to overlap, and how do they become more efficient in delivery?
Certainly, and in fact, these are not even all the intermediaries that we met over the course of the trip, just the ones that we actually had, just some of the ones that I could put on the slide, to be honest. But you're right, there's certainly a lot. And Social Enterprise Academy on the bottom left, another example of something that is unique. They're engaged in educating the public about social enterprise, starting from elementary school all the way to adult education. And this is a social enterprise itself that operates internationally as well. So interesting kinds of support that they have there. These are some of the enterprises that we visited. I won't dwell on them too much, except to point out that you'll see the sector that they're operating in is really interesting. So Homes for Good is social landlord. They provide housing, but Atlantis on the bottom left it's like a community center. Open Phoenix Cinema. Kibble is an education care center, but they also run the Experience, which is a racetrack. So the enterprises there, I think here we don't see that diversity of enterprises operating in different industries. So that's something that was interesting for me to see as well. And these are some of the notes that other enterprises, other participants sent over at the end of the trip. So a real learning opportunity for all of us. And interestingly, takeaways both good and bad. Darcey, David, any other thoughts that you'd like to add on just our trip as a whole?
Well, I think for me, Nabil, that there's a couple points that are really important. One of them is that this relationship with Scotland actually started back probably 8 or 9 years ago. So we've had this exchange and this learning together ongoing, which has been really valuable, and a very much based on a reciprocity of, Jerry Higgins and Yvonne, who you mentioned, were in Canada in March to visit government and social enterprises in Nova Scotia. We had a dialogue with about 10 different ministries and agencies and about 45 public servants in the federal government in Ottawa. We did visits in Toronto and the Toronto Social Enterprise Conference. That this exchange and this learning is an ongoing process. And I think this trip, the value was another level of learning, but also building social capital between not only the group that went, but the strengthening the social capital that we have with Scotland. So that's where I think there's real value in what we're trying to share with you today.
And I'm not too sure if this is necessarily the right point in the presentation to jump in with this piece, but when you talked about the presentation that we had with Internationalizing, their strategy for internationalizing social enterprise, I think that really speaks to the role and place that they've put the Scottish Government has valued in their social enterprise sector. Their internationalizing program involves them actually using social enterprise to accomplish other goals that they have, whether it's development, education, or general influence on international relations. It's social enterprise that's being used and brought forward to accomplish these other means, which I think really demonstrates the faith that they have and the confidence they have in their sector and how much they value it, that they're willing to have it come forward and play a role in the international scene that way.
Yeah, definitely, and that's a great kind of jump off, because the next point we're going to talk about is some of the. Sorry?
No, sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to interrupt. It's Peter here. What's fascinating is they're using asset-locked organizations to do economic development, thereby ensuring that the investments stay in Scotland.
Yeah, definitely, and we were just going to talk about that. Some of the observations that we had as a group on the policy and ecosystem there, where they've, as Darcey mentioned, they've really anchored social enterprise in their economic objectives and part of their strategy. And this is an ecosystem that has developed, as David said as well, over a long period of time. And this last point on this slide is I think for me interesting, is this is the social contract, so to speak, between government and the sector. Is the government will support the ecosystem, and the sector is responsible for delivering on that and helping create that social change, and that creates some of the rationale for that continued investment. Any thoughts from you, David or Darcey, on these?
So one of the pieces I thought that didn't necessarily actually come out during the week while we were there, but I've looked into since then is kind of looking at a per capita basis, how much money the Scottish Government is putting into their intermediaries and into the programs. And looking at the Just Enterprise program that you mentioned earlier, this is rolled out by, I believe, 11 different partner agencies that actually deliver the programming itself for their Just Enterprise program, looking at supports for social enterprise, and they were doing 4.8 million pounds over 4 years. So a quick back of napkin math of converting the currency and then doing it on a per capita basis, the Canadian equivalent would be $13.5 million a year. In our Manitoba context, I don't know how many people, there's many people who are watching here in Manitoba, but we're looking at about $500,000 Canadian per year on their Just Enterprise programming. So just some of those, so people can kind of get a bit of sense of the scale relative to the size of the population. I would also be very interested to see that crunched with the GDP as well.
So I think there's a really interesting conversation going on. Maybe Stewart and Kathy can bring it to the whole group, because I think it's really critical component of, as whenever we go, or Jerry Higgins is here, or I'm in Scotland, one of the things that on this trip it became very evident, they're a very tiny country, one time zone. So when we talk about the Scottish context of an ecosystem, there are some things that are particular to their context. One is the partnership, as Nabil and Darcey have talked about, between government and the sector that has evolved over the last 10 years. The second one is the investment by government into the intermediary and into the ecosystem building. But the third one that I think we often are challenged with here in Canada that is different in the Scotland context is we have 4.5 time zones and a gigantic country. So they can actually have a national meeting in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and some people in really remote areas have to drive like 3 hours or 4 hours. Some people have to get a ferry and drive, but they can have basically 90% of their organizations can gather with a 2-hour or less drive or train ride. So the capacity of that, or the advantage of that geography, is I think, a real interesting thing for us to try to have to grapple with, because we sort of have a lot of the pieces, but they're scattered across this humongous country. And so how do we take their learnings and apply it here?
Yeah, and one of the things that also came out for me, now that you mentioned that, David, throughout the trip, and like you said, it wasn't just interesting to see the Scotland perspective, but also to understand the perspectives of fellow Canadians on social enterprise, and see how Nova Scotia and BC and Ontario, just to take 3 examples, have approached social enterprise in their own unique way, that is, and they've developed their own, or are developing their own ecosystems based on the unique context in each province. And that's something to value in and of itself. Okay, I'll move on.
Kathy, do you want to address that at all?
Kathy and Stewart, and we're having some conversation.
Yeah. Maybe she's muted. Okay. No, she's only listening. Okay.
Just touching up on the network piece, though. This is Darcey here again. I think one of the pieces that really came out for me from Yvonne Strachan's presentation, she's the Deputy Director in the Scottish Government that leads their work on the third sector, so is responsible for their robust social enterprise strategies as well as their action plans. And her direct quote that she had at the conference was that trust is deeper than policy. And I think that really speaks to what David has been saying, what Nabil has been saying in terms of the strength of the relationships, but also just on a policy front and on a strategy front. For those of us who are working with government on their strategies and directing the investments, this notion that getting people in the same room and getting them knowing each other may be just as effective as a really well put together policy piece.
That actually takes us to our next point as well on relationships and connection, and I'm reminded actually also, we had one of the Canadian delegation who asked about legislation and how to support regulation for social enterprises, and the response from the Scottish Government representative, I forget his name, was, you have to win hearts and minds first, and everything else will follow. So in the same vein as, trust comes before policy, and once you've built that understanding and those relationships, it's much easier to move the needle. So some observations from the group here on relationships and connections. We were reminded that it's important for us to be checking in regularly with what's happening in the sector. Really important to have government and sector learning together. We saw that happening in Scotland, both that they were engaged in doing that, but also that it was helpful for us to be doing that through the tour, and really that we have some next steps for us. And this was, I think, the last point was actually from Kathy, which was on that, it's not just challenges that we face together, but also celebrating success together is really important as well. Over to you, Darcey. David, any reflections on this piece?
One piece I want to add in respects to government and sector working together and learning together. One of the pieces that was brought up, and it was by Yvonne Strachan as well, is the key element in their strategy and in government strategy of the acceptance of community empowerment. Now, I don't think I've been in this field long enough to to make substantiated comments on previous governments in Canada and their acceptance of community empowerment. But it struck me that we've got the sense from many people in the group that that was a bit of an interesting angle to look at, that the policy of actually ceding power and accepting that the power will be rolled out and will be held by the sector itself is a bit of a philosophical shift that they've embraced there that has led to the strengthening of the sector. And something to consider when we're looking at how we're going to empower community and where that power actually is handed off and where it lies. And David, if you have anything else there.
No,
I think that's good. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
And I think to Stewart's point in the chat box, this is an evolving process, and the other side of it in Scotland to realize not only did they have the trust, but they had John Swinney, who was minister and now is the deputy first minister, which means he's like the number 2 person. John Swinney, back in 2007 and 2008, actually became the minister, the champion within government for the sector. So they had a strong social enterprise sector, which we've seen people like Kibble, who've been around for 40 or 50 years, leadership in people like Jerry Higgins and others. And then on the government side, they really had champions like John Swinney, and they had really supportive public servants like Yvonne. So it's an interesting thing when you, in terms of looking at what are the pieces that they had in terms of these building that trust. I mean, they all had to work on building the trust, but they had some interesting components.
I'm reminded of a thing that Jerry said, that they didn't always have that government support, but the sector knew that they needed to be working together closely and be ready for that. And that was part of that was quite intentional, where sector representatives prepared themselves for the day when government would become supportive, and when they did, they were ready to jump on it and really reinforce that. We've also kind of heard that this is we're getting to a moment in time in Canada as well, at the provincial and federal level, where there is increasing support for social enterprise and social innovation. So there's definitely an opportunity coming up.
Yeah. And Peter's point in the chat box is, this is not we have a long way to go, because that's not, Darcey, as you reflected on, that's not necessarily the tradition in Canada to have that kind of trust and partnership. So we do have a long way to go in building that kind of co-creative thing. As Mike pointed out, Quebec has a lot of strength in this history and this kind of tradition, but I think in many of the provinces and federally, we just don't have that tradition of creating trust and co-creation on policy and practice, which when we looked at that conference we went to, the one-day conference, they run that every year, and every year it's on those 2 pieces, practice and policy.
Okay, so last bit, I know we're running a little over, but I will just quickly finish with the last section that we spoke about, which was some of our observations on the sector, on the enterprises themselves. So very diverse and creative industries and social services, strong distinction between urban and rural enterprises. One of the things in the middle there, they are ambitious, but they're also demanding of government, and they believe that they must operate as business first and foremost. That does not mean that they necessarily believe that, but at the same time, as Peter has also pointed out, that they believe in an asset lock. They have a voluntary code of practice for social enterprise, which I should have created a slide to put it on there, but it's the de facto definition of social enterprise that is used by the sector there, and really speaks to that community piece. And finally, some of our participants were surprised by the number of organizations using the KIC, the community interest company structure, and the diversity of those users. About just over 10% of the 5,000 plus social enterprises are KICs, and that's just one of the legal forms that is available to enterprises there. Darcey, David, any points from you on this?
One of the points that I was coming away with, and throughout this trip and throughout the reflections since it, I've always sort of had this bit of a lens of that. Where is Scotland at, and is that our trajectory? And if it is our trajectory, are we looking 10 years into the future? Which is a little disingenuous and a little not quite true to context. But I think one big piece coming out of that and thinking about it that way is the expectations we have for the financial sustainability of social enterprises. We found out from Jonathan at the Social Value Lab that the majority of their social enterprises are operating at a break-even margin. And accepting that and appreciating that, I think, is important, that we keep our expectations in check for the opportunities for social enterprise growth and the opportunities for social enterprise viability. So recognizing that even in one of the most robust and strong sectors in the world for social enterprise, they're still largely operating at break-even, which is totally fine. We just need to make sure that that our policymakers, and in particular champions from other sectors, recognize that there are limitations to the business side of things and to the surplus side of things that, if not kept in check, will create a totally false pretense of where we can go with social enterprise support. I don't know if David agrees with that.
Well, I don't disagree at all, because I think one of the things that's as important is as Nabil pointed out, they have some very interesting models of social enterprise. Part of it is the UK recognition that a lot of nonprofits are in a contractual relationship with government or others, so they are social enterprises. And I think the other thing is I think Scotland is really strong in some areas, but I think we have to also recognize that I don't think we're 8 or 10 years behind. I think some of the contexts that we work with in terms of Canada, and we look at some of the successes in terms of like the policies in Manitoba, the emerging, as Mike Townsend pointed out, the emerging relationships and sector in Nova Scotia. As I think Sandra pointed out in the chat box, some of the developing procurement stuff that's going on in Western Canada and other parts. I think sometimes, as you said, Kathy said, we have to celebrate some of our value that is being created in the social enterprise sector. I mean, Darcey, you look at Build and Aki Energy in Manitoba. Those are like internationally, people are very, very envious internationally of that kind of impact, right? So I think we have to balance some of the learning from Scotland, but not disavow the successes that we're having in Canada in terms of, I mean, when I think back to the relationship with Scotland, our learnings from the 2010 Olympics were really impactful for how they developed their social purchasing in Scotland. They've been able to, go a bit further, and now we're trying to go back and forth. So I think we have to be careful. It's like, I don't think they're 10 years ahead. I think there's real value being exchanged both ways. And I'm not sure that our social enterprises are not as diverse. I don't think we have an electric go-kart racing track in Canada, but I think we do have some real diversity that we don't always recognize because we don't call it necessarily social enterprise in the Canadian context.
Fair point. And interestingly, the census as well, there's a number that I'm remembering right now. About 36% of enterprises will not recognize themselves as social enterprises, even there as well. So, I'm going to, just conscious of time, I'm going to ask if there are any participants who were on the trip with us who would like to share their reflections, and you can put them in the chat box, and I can read them out, or before we move to questions, or you can speak up as well.
I can set microphone rights for participants, so those of you on your computer might be able to speak. Just want you all to be aware of sound, and if you're finding that there's if we find that there's too much noise from allowing microphone rights, then we'll switch back. So everyone should have microphone capacity now on their computers, as long as you have a microphone on your computer. So those of you on your computers, if you would like to speak up, you should be able to do that now.
So Kathy's mentioned that it was really valuable in many ways, learning lessons from other jurisdictions and building strong relationships here in Ontario as well. I'd second that, Kathy, being from Ontario as well. And if you don't have,
I think it's kind of interesting that we had some real engagement by some governments and other governments. And then we had some other provinces that just said, well, I can't afford this kind of trip. And I'm like going, I'm just sort of amazed that, I mean, I don't know how we build on this in the future. Do we try to do more of these learning events as a way of building trust in government that Kathy's talking about? Do we make this something ongoing? So I'd be interested to know what people think. How do we leverage this?
Hi, it's Kathy here. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Kathy. Yes,
oh,
Kathy.
Great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I was going to say the same thing as David. I think one of the challenges we have is, you know, these work-study tours are great opportunities, not to just experience somebody else's, you know, how somebody else is handling the issues that we're struggling with or that we're trying to celebrate, but also building the connections between ourselves. But for example, recently we have gotten together with a group called the Federation of Voluntary Sector Networks across Canada and our provincial government counterparts every 2 years. But our 2017 meeting has been canceled because provincial government colleagues have travel bans. So they can't travel out of province. And so ironically, in that case, it was the nonprofit sector partners that were able to, that would have been able to find the money to get together for, you know, a meeting that happens every 2 years, but our government colleagues could not. So I think we have to think about how other ways, you know, really how to express the value of trips like this, but also secondly, other ways of engaging people in the conversations if they can't leave their communities.
and we had certainly discussed some of these. So here's a slide that, you know, where some of the actions that we discussed as a group going back, you know, building public support for social enterprise development, I think really important. Establishing a network of practitioners and supporting that networking piece at the provincial, at the municipal, at the federal level is really important. Of course, I have a bias there because I belong to a network, so I'm biased, but I do think it's really important, and ensuring that there's space for reflection and celebration on a regular basis. So anyone of our attendees, any questions for us? Or do we want to continue sharing some of the things that we were thinking about? I see a few people are typing, so I'll just wait for that.
Can I jump in with one more takeaway that I had from there to consider for those of us who are involved doing strategies? One of the pieces that they had that again Yvonne Strachan spoke to was updating, resetting their strategy action items every 3 years. And I thought that was a really interesting way of going about having their high overarching strategy that was in place to build the ecosystem, but then every 3 years reassessing what resources they have at their disposal and what is the most strategic and valuable investments to make at that time with those resources that are in line with where the strategy's at. I think this is something that we'll want to pick up, at least in Manitoba, is that we have a strategy that's a bit broad, but has very specific action items, which we're working on right now, but we don't necessarily have certainty that there will be support or what our resources are going to be going into the future. So the ability to keep with the strategy at a high level consistent with it, but then reassess our action items based upon the resources that we have at that time, I thought was a great way to ensure that, to ensure a strategic use of what's available.
Sorry, I was muted. We've certainly seen that in Ontario, where they have come up with a new social enterprise strategy 3 years after the first one was launched in 2013. So there's definitely that appetite to continue revisiting and setting new goals and targets here. But as multiple people have pointed out, still a long way to go there. Here in Ontario, certainly. Curious to hear if anyone has reflections from, maybe David can share or Mike Townsend can share some reflections from BC and Nova Scotia, respectively, on social enterprise strategy development.
Well, there isn't one in British Columbia. So we used to have a thing called Partners for Social Innovation, which went for 3 years and came up with a number of recommendations in a broader sense, including social enterprise in that arena. But then when their government shifted, that all got set aside. And I think that's part of what, the discussion in the chat room of between policy and trust really is a tough one, because every time there's an election, like happened in Manitoba, does that shift our trust? Does it shift our policy opportunities? So I'm always caught between like how much we can do as a sector without the partnership with government, and how much we are sort of relying on government but don't want to rely on government, and how do we strengthen our resilience to be able to go beyond election cycles, finding other resources or other models. And I think that's part of what Stewart Wolf may have been referring to in terms of how we're evolving, because definitely in the last 10 years, the reliance on a government top-down model to a sector-built model is definitely shifting. But I don't think we're to a partnership point, because a couple of people have pointed out that does government really understand co-creation, or is it just a word right now? So I think maybe Stewart's point of we're in an evolution of that relationship is a really critical one for us to keep in the context of where are we in this path of development.
Hi, this is Paul Chamberlain. I'm not sure if you're hearing me. So yeah, I was actually going to connect to that same point. It was Kathy who'd mentioned earlier about the use of the term co-creation by both the federal and provincial Ontario government, and sort of not being sure if they know what it means and how it works elsewhere in Canada. But certainly, I mean, I think if we look at the example of the recent social enterprise strategy in Ontario, we certainly had a lot of pretty solid consultation that was part of it, which was great. Certainly, way more than in the first incarnation of the strategy. But again, if we contrast it with the process of co-development that happened in Manitoba with the recent Manitoba strategy, I mean, I think there we're looking at where there is that sort of community empowerment, and it really was a very solid co-creation. So yeah, finding ways and to get that message across that is a way to be able to co-create, and that it's actually positive both for the government and the community when that kind of co-creation happens. Is something that I guess we need to work on, and interested in any thoughts or reflections around that.
We had, someone pointed out to me, and this is just to kind of add my own 2 cents as well on this topic. We think about, who do you build relationships with, and is it with the public servants, or who presumably will be on those policy files for longer than political staff. And one of the things that I've heard that over recently is go for the political staff, because they can drive what the public servants do. So again, comes down to building that trust within government and getting political will on your side. So I'm just going to read out Stewart's made a really interesting point, which I just scrolled to read it and it disappeared. Stewart says that my point re-evolving was mainly response to the point about how intimidating the whole model of all dimensions for a strong ecosystem. They don't appear all formed. It's important to keep them in mind, but to build incrementally and see where we can jump on opportunities when openings occur. So it's a building process, not a magical wave of wand and make it all appear process. And Sandra's made a very good point as well, as which is what is the role of private sector actors committing to buying for social enterprise? So referring to social procurement there. And Mike is dreaming of a wand. Kathy disagrees with me as well. She says you can't just, well, not quite disagreeing, but it's reinforcing you have to build championship over long term. So in the public service. So also really important.
Should we wrap it up, Nabil? Sounds like we.
Yeah, it seems like a natural conclusion time. I think we've shared all these slides here. So I'd like to thank our speakers today, David, Nabil, and Darcey, and for a very engaged participation from everybody on the call. I know a number of you were also in the tour, and those of you that aren't brought a lot of important perspective to this conversation. It's obviously a conversation that we need to continue to build upon. There's lots of work to be done to build our provincial or regional ecosystems, and in order to support a national ecosystem. And it'll be the trick to figure out how to get the appropriate government support that we need, but also finding different ways of finding support in other jurisdictions. It'll be interesting to do a follow-up later on. If you like this session and are interested in similar sessions or sessions on different topics, please do contact us. We'd be interested in pursuing topics that are of interest to everyone. I'll add my email address here at the bottom, so you can contact me there. We will be following up with you again shortly with the webinar recording, a link to the webinar recording. Also, you should have just received, actually, in your inbox, a link to a survey for today's call, so you can also provide your feedback in that survey as to what you thought was good, what you thought could be improved, and you can also include in your survey response suggestions for future sessions. So I thank you all for your time today and wish you a wonderful Thanksgiving. I give thanks to all of you that you're all fighting the good fight and trying to advance social enterprise in your own jurisdictions. So thanks, everyone.